Hello and welcome to the second review of Requests Month 2016. This is Shadowgate, the 2014 remake for PC, Mac, Linux, and iOS. And this one's coming to you courtesy of Diana Rose, so thank you for that. It is greatly appreciated. This is a remake of the classic 1987 adventure game Shadowgate, which was a Macintosh game back in the day, and it later got ported to lots of different systems. But this remake was made by Zoojoy and was released in 2014 after having a successful Kickstarter campaign. And while I certainly didn't contribute to the Kickstarter in any way, I did pay attention to what was going on with it since I do have an interest in the original Shadowgate. Well, sort of the original. I played the NES version, which is a fairly cut-down port of the Mac version. I do have a copy of the Mac version now because they re-released it on Steam as part of the Mac Adventure series, and I will be eventually going through that, but I haven't actually played the Mac version of the game yet. I've only played the NES version, which was hilarious. You see, the original Shadowgate, and particularly the NES version, has become infamous for the sheer amount of ways you can die horribly, which are also often rather hilarious when they're combined with the NES's really messed up text, where it's not really well translated or just well written, and so you end up with wonderful phrases like, upon using the hammer on yourself, it says, you thrust a hammer into your chest, which is a pretty amusing mental image if you really think about it. The adventurer just taking this big warhammer and just thrusting it into their chest. But anyway, it was things like that that gave the NES version in particular a lot of charm. It was just silly. You couldn't help but go into this thing, and even when it did get frustrating, it was just hilarious. So that, of course, does beg the question, does the remake retain a lot of that really goofy, ridiculous charm? Or does it take things a bit more seriously and change things up? Let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out. Now, as far as presentation goes, this is obviously leaps and bounds ahead of the original Shadowgate as well as the NES version, and really any version of the game up until they actually did this remake. Because let's face it, the original release of the game was monochrome on Macintosh, and later on they re-released it across other systems, eventually adding in color, but it was still all working with 2D sprite work that was pretty low res. And while 2D sprite work obviously has aged pretty gracefully, the developers of the remake wanted to do things a bit differently, so what they went with instead was hand-painted backgrounds, and man do they look good. I mean, sure, in a lot of spots there's a general lack of color, but you are wandering around in the dungeons of Castle Shadowgate and such, so you wouldn't exactly expect a huge amount of color in those areas. And even then, the game actually throws quite a bit of color at you in certain areas to just really make things pop. And it works very well in the game's favor. And that's on top of the hand-painted backgrounds themselves just being very high quality. Where things get a bit more iffy is in the cutscene department, because it does have that hand-painted look in those as well. And with this particular style of artwork, the characters themselves end up not looking all that great during those cutscenes. And it's not just that. The cutscenes themselves, as well as the game itself really, suffer from a general lack of movement in everything that's going on. Instead of really having actual cutscenes, you have more slideshows with text that comes up over them and voiceovers, and instead of a lot of movement in the environment, only a handful of things will move, and it actually looks fairly at odds with what's going on in the background, because the background's all this hand-painted stuff, and the things moving aren't, really. And sometimes that effect can be a bit jarring, but it also means that the environments themselves are relatively static. Sure, you'll see things like fog moving around, and the flames will flicker on your torch as well as the torches in the environment. Sometimes creatures will pop up, but generally speaking, you're going to be staring at a pretty static background for the majority of the game. Luckily, there's a fair number of backgrounds in this game, and the background artwork never really gets all that old, but it's certainly not for everyone. And that leads us over to the sound design, which is really dominated by one particular aspect, which is the music. The music is basically a remix of the soundtrack from the NES version of the game, which had music done by Hiroyuki Masuno, and that was filled with a bunch of tracks that were pretty simple for the most part, but surprisingly effective, partly because a lot of them were just really catchy, and partly because some of them were actually kind of creepy when you got down to it. And what they've basically done with that is they've taken it and made it an orchestral soundtrack. So it fits in with this theme of high adventure, but there's just something not quite there if you've played the NES version. It's really just kind of a nostalgia thing, where the NES version's music was just so damn catchy, and it just kind of embeds in your brain and stays there. Whereas in this one, the soundtrack is definitely good, but it doesn't quite stick with you in the same way as the NES versions did. But again, that's really more of a nitpick done from nostalgia perspective than anything else. Now, a couple of things that are definitely superior over the older versions of the game are the sound effects, which all fit very nicely with what's going on, and in many cases are actually pretty atmospheric, so they did a great job with that, as well as the voice acting, which the older versions of the game just straight up didn't have. And the new voice acting definitely breathes a bit more life into the game. It's just that on occasion it's pretty cheesy, so you just need to be prepared to put up with that.
If you wish, it makes little difference. Seal your fate within this living castle of the dead.
If you go into this thing expecting cheesy fantasy adventure game voice acting, then you probably won't be disappointed. It's not that the voice acting is bad, it's actually rather solid for what it is. It's just that, again, it's pretty cheesy, so you just had to be prepared to deal with that. But ultimately what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is actually pretty minimal, although it was even more minimal back in the day. As far as the remake goes, you play as a guy named Jer who goes into the living castle of Shadowgate, which used to be where the Circle of 12, these ridiculously powerful wizards, would meet and just do their thing, at least until one of their number effectively betrayed them in the pursuit of power. His name was Talamar the Black, and he eventually became known as the Warlock Lord. And to make a long story short, the Warlock Lord is obviously evil, and you are the hero who is sent into Castle Shadowgate in order to vanquish him once and for all, and prevent him from getting the behemoth, which would allow him to basically just do whatever he wanted. And while they certainly include a lot more story than what I played in the NES version, they still don't really do a huge amount to actually keep you invested in the plot of the game. It's a pretty simple story. You're the hero. You have to assemble the Staff of Ages in order to defeat the Warlock Lord once and for all. And for a lot of people, that's probably enough. For others who are like me and you're more into adventure games for the plot and such like that, you're going to find that the plot is pretty lacking. The thing is, I can set it aside because the original game was released in 1987. Would I have liked to see a more complex story that really fleshes out the lore of the land and everything? Sure, it would have been fine. But this ultimately is a remake of a 1987 adventure game where the plot really wasn't the thing that was center stage. What was really center stage there was the gameplay, which was a pretty straightforward kind of first-person point-and-click adventure game. And to say it was an old-school adventure game is really a bit of an understatement. Let's put it this way. The original game is pretty crude when you get down to it. You have a surprising amount of verbs that you can do, things like examine, open, close, speak, etc. And the idea was that you would go around these various environments, pick up all the items you could find, and use them to solve various puzzles, and avoid an untimely and often rather gruesome demise. The original game kind of became known for having all these really gruesome ways in which you could die, like getting into a pool of acid and just melting in this incredibly gruesome manner, or getting burned alive by a dragon, or all sorts of things like that. And I really think Shadowgate became more known for its deaths than anything else, because when you get down to it, it's really not that great of an adventure game. A lot of the puzzles in the original game, and certainly in the NES version I played as well, are, well, for lack of a better term, kind of ridiculous. And a lot of them require little more than just a ridiculous amount of trial and error, except that the game wouldn't really give you much of an opportunity to do that, because the game would often give you situations where you needed to do one particular thing pretty much immediately upon entering an area, and if you didn't do it, then you just die. And so if you didn't know what to do, you would basically just try everything you possibly could until something worked. And these days we would look back on that sort of design and find it both incredibly crude and blatantly unfair. Because let's face it, a well-designed puzzle makes you actually use your brain instead of just trying random crap until something works. And that did happen a fair bit in the original Shadowgate. So that begs the question of how they tackled this problem when they remade it. Well, they kinda didn't tackle the problem. What they did do was simplify the interface so it's a lot easier to work with now. You now have a radial menu that pops up when you can click on things, and it will tell you different actions that you can do. On higher difficulty settings, when you go to, for example, the master difficulty level, then it will give you all of the options and you just use whatever you think works best in the particular situation. If you think that hitting something will work best, you hit the icon that says hit. If you think that trying to eat something will be the optimal solution, then you click the one that says eat. And that's pretty much how the original game operated. You had the verbs sitting in an area where you could just click them, and then you could click on things in the environment or click on things in your inventory and such like that. And the same thing goes here. It's a very easy interface to work with. Although there are a few oddities you'll have to get used to. For example, when you need to use an item on yourself, there is a portrait in the top right corner of the screen. When you click on that, that is self. And you may not necessarily know that because the game doesn't exactly do its best to teach you how to play it. It pretty much assumes that you have played the original Shadowgate, and thus that you can go into this thing and just kind of figure out everything on your own. If you have played the original Shadowgate, this is going to feel very familiar. It's just getting used to the way the interface is laid out now. But if you're new to Shadowgate, then you can play it on the Novice difficulty, and this interface is greatly simplified. Instead of showing all of the icons at once that you can just mess around with, it only shows the things that you can do with that particular item. So for example, let's say you wanted to pick up a rock, and you clicked on the rock. It would come up with a thing that would let you examine the rock, and it would also come up with an icon that lets you pick up the rock. In the full difficulty version, it would give you all of the icons. In the lower difficulties, it only gives you the ones that you can actually interact with it using. So that does help a bit for newer players, but even then, you're still going to run into problems with the puzzles themselves often just being very obtuse. Some of them are actually telegraphed in the game. In fact, it gives you solutions right off the bat, and you may not necessarily know their solutions, which is the funny part, because you might spend hours just digging around looking for everything that you could possibly find on a specific puzzle. You try everything you can think of and nothing works, and the solution's been staring you in the face the whole time because there was some scroll you picked up earlier, or there was a chart that you found, or something like that that tells you the solution right there. You just weren't looking hard enough. And that can be kind of frustrating, but then there's the older school people like me who find that sort of thing perfectly fine. And that brings up something very important for the Shadowgate remake. It's not for the faint of heart. It is not for people who go into this thing expecting it to hold their hand throughout and just be able to tell them the solution to everything. It does have some hints that you can do. You can find the skull early on in the game that will actually talk to you and help you out with some hints here and there if you ask it. But other than that, you may be completely clueless if you've never played Shadowgate before, and if you don't look up a walkthrough. I actually know people who have played the original game and have played the NES version like I have, and they couldn't beat the game without a walkthrough. I actually had to resort to a walkthrough on occasion for this as well, and then I looked at the solution for some of those puzzles and I was like, why didn't I think of that? And maybe it's just the fact that there are some differences between the NES version and the original Mac version that this is really based on. But I still was left completely clueless on some of those puzzles. And when I switched this thing on the highest difficulty setting because I was a Shadowgate veteran and I thought I could handle it, I was left completely clueless on several occasions because I had just missed something earlier on in the game, and I didn't notice it because I had played the NES version, which did have some different puzzles from the Mac version, so that's something to keep in mind. On top of all of that, you're going to be having to do a lot of backtracking in this game. You're going to have to go back and forth between areas you've already been and new areas that you haven't been in order to find everything you need in order to complete the puzzles. In some instances, that's a bit telegraphed, in others, not so much. And so you might just end up wandering around Shadowgate for even hours on end sometimes, just not really knowing where you're supposed to go, what exactly you missed, when it could just be a fairly simple detail that was in the background and you thought you knew what it meant, but you didn't know what it meant after all. And the backtracking does bring up something that's pretty annoying in this game, which is navigation. It's just a pain in the ass to go from place to place. There's no real fast travel system, and that's partly because of the mechanic that they retained from the original Shadowgate, which was, if your torch burns out, you die. And the way they determine how your torch burns out is through the number of steps you take. Each step is considered a turn, and after a certain number of turns, your torch will burn out. So you need to make sure that you always have a torch ready to go and to replace your old burnt out torch. Although when the torch burns out, you die instantly, so you do need to make sure that you just keep the torch topped off. And it does show up in the bottom right of your corner, so you can tell when the torch is burning down. It's just not as easy to tell as it was in the older versions of the game. So there's one design aspect of the remake remake that's actually straight up inferior to the older versions. The fact that it's a little bit harder to tell when your torch is burning out versus when it actually is full blast and everything. But that's just because of the way that the particle effects are going on with that particular torch icon. So, frankly, I'm kind of surprised they didn't improve it over time, but oh well. Does all of this mean that it's a bad game? No, it just means that it's a very dated game. It is a remake of a game that came out in 1987, and they tried to remain as true to the original as possible. That came with a bunch of drawbacks. This is not very accessible to new players at all. But for those of us who played the original Shadowgate, it feels very familiar. For those of us who are old school adventure game fans, we find that it's fairly easy to adapt to. And that should make it pretty clear who the target demographic for the Shadowgate remake are. It's people who were fans of the original Shadowgate and old school adventure game fans, looking for some nostalgia. But if you are the kind of patient gamer who can go back to those old school adventure games and enjoy the living hell out of them despite their problems, you will probably enjoy Shadowgate Remake. You'll also probably enjoy the original Shadowgate. You just have to remember two things. First, this game does not remotely hold your hand. If anything, it just kicks you around with iron boots. And you have to be prepared to fail a lot. Save early, save often. That may sound like an archaic mantra these days, but it really does apply to this game in particular. You never know what is going to kill you in this game, and you never necessarily know how it's going to kill you and what you can do to prevent it. So what you need to do is you need to save pretty often, and just try different things. And when you find something that works, you've figured out the puzzle. That's really also the game's biggest problem. The puzzles are mostly trial and error and not much else. While there are a few logic puzzles here and there, and while there are a few that will instantly spring to your mind because they make total sense, some of them just require you to try different things until eventually something works. And that is really pretty crude puzzle design. I get why they kept it in this, because they were trying to be as true to the original as possible, but it really does make this thing feel pretty archaic, even for a remake. So if you're looking for a visual enhancement and a sound enhancement to the original Shadowgate, this is going to be right up your alley. But if you were just looking for a kind of old school adventure game, or just an adventure game in general, then this one might give you some problems. And really, it does end up being a fairly crude game when you get down to it. But I really can't deny that I still enjoyed my time with the Shadowgate remake. It certainly wasn't quite the same as playing the NES version. I have plenty of nostalgia over the NES version, and it's pretty hilarious. The remake isn't really all that funny. It takes itself a lot more seriously, even though it does still have a lot of the ridiculous crap that was in the original version and, of course, the NES version. But you don't get the goofy translations, and not all of it is exactly the same as you would remember it from the NES version. So it just doesn't quite have the same goofy, ridiculous charm that the old school versions do. And thus I am giving this a conditional 2.5 out of 5. If you're like me, you're a fan of the original Shadowgate, you want more Shadowgate, you want an updated version of it, this will be right up your alley. But if you're a newer player, then this will probably get into the 2.5 territory. In that case, if it looks interesting to you, I'd say pick it up on sale and give it a try. And if nothing else, you can always keep a walkthrough handy and play it on the lowest difficulty if the puzzles end up just really bothering you. But really, it all comes down to being able to put up with the game's problems in order to get at that really old school core underneath. And that's not exactly something that everyone can do. Hence, again, it's a cautionary 2.5. Thanks for watching.